I did have this rapper that I would record, and he discovered the autotune. Like, he had me put it on for something, like to just record the chorus or something. Yeah. And he was like, that's so cool. And so then he just started always doing with that. And, they come in a group of like 3 or 4 rappers. And so he would go in there and he'd be like, put that autotune on. And I look back and the other rappers are like rolling their eyes like, he's at it again. Like, he's obsessed with the autotune. But he like always had to have it on. So it was hilarious.
You're listening to the GWNL Podcast. Guys with no lives talking about audio.
Episode 4. Welcome. This is Joe. We have our buddies Ben and Bryant. Say hello to the crew.
Hello.
Hey. That's embarrassing, Ben. Anyways, the awkward wave really sets the tone for today. So this is episode 4. Surprisingly, we've made it to episode 4 when we all thought we would probably quit. They forced me to get onto a condenser mic in spite of my constant fighting against it as a live sound engineer. What's wrong with the Switch 58? That's all I have to say. No. So tonight is episode 4. It's effects. We're talking about effects. This is a very beefy subject because there's a lot of different things that we have to cover tonight. And there's a lot of different things that we can cover. With that being said, we're really only going to be able to touch an overview kind of all these things because there are so many different plugins and effects that you can be using. So first and foremost, Bryant, can you give us our 5 effects that we are going to talk about? There's 5 different types.
Categories,
yeah. We're going to talk about time-based effects and like reverb, delay, phase, and then we're going to talk about pitch-based effects, and then we will be talking about like distortion as an effect.
Right.
Okay.
So, Is it cool if I jump into like time-based effects?
I guess.
I learned something pretty. I learned something pretty cool. Like most time-based effects are like similar to each other. So if you start at like the smallest level, you've got a phaser, and basically how that works is it just delays the signal just a little bit. But the cool thing about a phaser is that it changes how much it's delayed based off of a low frequency oscillator or an LFO.
Right.
And then on the next time-based effect, the next one up, you have a doubler, which that's delaying the signal by usually about 5 to like 15, 20-ish milliseconds.
With a doubler, are they doing any type of panning, or is it the same location, like left to right?
Depending on how you're using it, it can be up the middle.
Okay.
It can be panned.
I was curious.
I would say normally, like in a live sound situation, the doubler is probably on that one channel, so it's probably panned in the center. In the studio, you probably have a little bit more flexibility.
Right.
And generally in the studio, the way you're getting a doubling is through actually tracking another double. That's different,
like
though.
Double tracking as opposed, but yeah, I think the biggest thing to bring out in the first, like talking about time-based effects, is that this 50 millisecond threshold. So 50 milliseconds, that's where above 50 milliseconds is when it becomes delay, and below 50 milliseconds is when it's really time-based effects. So like chorus and flanger and doubling and such, those are all like having delays in there that are less than 50 milliseconds.
Right.
But that's where it starts to sound like an audible repeat. It starts to sound weird a little bit before that, but that's the threshold of an audible repeat. So
with that, I don't know if you clarified it because it's still kind of a little confusing. What he means by audible repeat is it sounds like 2 separate sounds or like 2 things occurring at 50 milliseconds and later. Before 50 milliseconds, it sounds like it's the same sound, but it might be coming from like either a different direction. That's when we get into things like the Haas effect, which we're not going to dive into too much tonight. But like that's a thing to be aware of. 50 milliseconds after that, it starts to sound like a repeat or a doubling of that, or like a delay, like a echo.
And all these cool effects are that joined together sound that's less than 50 milliseconds, so it doesn't sound like 2 sounds. Right. It sounds like one that sounds different.
Cool.
Yeah, but cool. Yeah.
And then after we get to like the echo / delay, when we talk about delay, we're talking about like an echo. If
Which
you go
is
if
the
if you go
worst
past
term
that-
ever.
Yeah,
Because people refer to echo as reverb and echo as delay, but
yeah,
They don't
But yeah.
understand.
And then
Yeah.
if you add multiple delays together, like multiple delays, like 70 or 480, then you get into your reverbs. And basically reverbs are just like multiple delays together. At least as far as I understand. There's some other things that can go into reverb as well.
yeah,
But
it's basically recreating the myriad of delays that are going to happen in a physical environment. And
Right.
it could be like thousands of delays at different times. Every time it bounces off a surface, it slows down. It loses energy, and it also loses, different energy at different pitches, at different frequencies, and so it like EQs the delay. So, anyways, reverb is super complex,
And
but it's
yeah, like with reverb, there's a lot of different types of reverb. I don't want to get into that because that's a whole that could be an episode in and of itself. Like any one, for the record, any one of these effects that we just talked about could be an entire episode. Sorry for hitting my mic. Could be an entire episode in and of itself. Anyways, Bryant, hit us with some more.
So yeah, that's just kind of like a brief overview of the different types of time-based effects that we'll be covering, and kind of like all of the time-based effects. Of course, there's other things that you can get into, but at the basis, that's the different types of time-based effects. It's essentially how much are you delaying the signal and how many times you're delaying the signal.
but what are you doing to it? Because like chorus is one where it's just a short delay, like 20 milliseconds, and then you vary the pitch of the delayed one, and that creates that chorus effect.
And then with phase, like a phaser, just like I brought up, an LFO, a low frequency oscillator, that's changing how much the signal is delayed by. And so if you have a signal that's out of phase with itself, like you double a signal, like you can do this as an exercise. Go ahead and like open up your digital audio workstation and put an audio file in there, whatever it is, duplicate the track, and then zoom in super far and just nudge it over just a little bit. It's going to sound really bad. And basically what the LFO is doing is it's changing how much it's being delayed by within a very, very small amount. And so you get these cool artifacts that is what we know as a phaser.
So if I might jump in, my understanding is always what you just described as a flanger. The phaser has to do more with actually having like a notch filter that's sweeping and creating that phase interference.
The frequency is being controlled by an LFO as it travels across.
The frequency is. But like the flanger is more what you're talking about, where the both the delay and the pitch, like the delay time and the pitch are being affected by the same LFO, and it's trying to recreate that like ADT effect, the flanging effect of the Beatles, where you're taking a tape machine and slowing it. You're getting it to be ahead of or behind the original. And so as it moves ahead of it, it's going to go up in pitch and speed, and as it moves behind, it's going to go down in pitch and speed, and so that's controlled by the LFO. But that's like a flanging ADT effect.
Maybe I misunderstood phase.
Yeah, but all of that is messing with the phase.
Right.
So that the flanger is messing with the phase, but I think the actual phaser effect is
actually a notch filter.
Is a notch filter that travels back and forth.
Okay.
So
My
like,
bad. Sorry guys.
I'm gonna
okay.
I'm gonna go into another thing here. Almost every single one of these effects are in like where they've taken parts and pieces of like, again, delay, time, reverb, time-based pitch, distortion. All of these things generally get intermingled a lot. That's why we're talking about how like, oh, it's this thing that's controlled by this thing, which is controlled. And honestly, a lot of effects were designed because they were like happy accidents that they were like, oh, this is cool. Like, look at the Beatles. They're a good example of that. We're like, hey, let's plug this thing into this thing. Anyways, okay, so that was time-based and kind of phasing with, have we covered pitch-based yet?
Yeah, so
I think we need to move on before we get too deep into the woods.
And the phase one's kind of weird because it is still time-based because it's slightly out of phase, but it's the weirdest. It's kind of in between. But yeah, we should go to pitch.
Right.
So the pitch-based effects are all like the autotune kind of things.
Yeah.
And where you auto-tune it so hard that it becomes
Robotic.
robotic sounding.
Was it?
And then
Was it Celine Dion? Was the one with the
Cher.
No, Cher. Yeah.
Cher, Cher.
Cher's the one
I
that made
got
it
it.
popular, and then it's known as like the T-Pain sound.
Yeah. Well,
Which
and the
they were
T-Pain one-
using it as like they weren't. Yes, go on.
Yeah,
Ben, just-
they used it as real
bad.
pitch correction, but then there were some artists that they pushed it up a little bit, maybe because the artist messed up, or maybe because they wanted to sound like an effect. But there's one thing where you're actually like pushing it really hard to sound robotic, but then there's also this thing about the formant, which
Right.
is the formant control is when it pitches up or down, it makes you actually sound like a larger or smaller person with a longer vocal cavity, which is going to change the harmonic structure of your voice or the timbre of your voice. And so they'll have that connected, so the formant changes, and that gets, I think the T-Pain effect is more having both the really hard auto-tuning plus the formant change to
Right.
create that effect.
Yeah, definitely.
One more plug for like auto tuning. It's not bad. Auto tuning can save a lot of people time. It can save a lot of people money, and it can make things a lot easier on the artists. It's really easy to sit there. Sorry, I'm making a big plug for this because a lot of people are like, "Oh, auto tune's evil." It's not, because think about these musicians who are possibly playing 4 to 6 shows, and like their vocals are dead. Like that's a lot of performance, like 2-hour sets for some of these like major performing and touring artists. And before people start getting all like, oh, autotune takes the scale out of it. Look, autotune can correct your pitch, but it can't correct musicianship. If you suck at things like style, it can't fix your style. You can't suddenly articulate a word better because of autotune. Yes, it simplifies things. It can allow people who might not have the best time. It can allow people who might not have the best things. Autotune is not bad. People need to get rid of that concept that it's bad. It can be bad, but so can any other effect used inappropriately.
Also, singing with autotune is actually pretty difficult. Like,
Yeah, it is.
If you want a great example of how good T-Pain actually is, check out his interview on Ellen, because Ellen tried to sing with the autotune on, and Ellen, she can't sing, and so it doesn't sound good. But then when T-Pain does it, since he can actually sing and knows how to use autotune as an effect, it sounds incredible, and it's a really cool effect, especially live.
I did that to one of my vocalists one day. We were doing like a rehearsal, and I'm like, I'm just gonna slap the autotune on. She had in-ear monitors, and she was like, I hate this. This sounds horrible. Because like if you've ever tuned instruments and they're like really close in pitch, that's kind of like what you're doing, but it's a version of you. So it's really like an out of body experience, and it really throws off live performances.
If you hear both,
Yeah. That's why, like, if I do that, I only do it in the mains. I never do it in their ears because that'll mess them up so bad. Anyways, but yeah.
I did
pitch
one
break,
more thing on that, though. I did have this rapper that I would record, and he discovered the auto-tune. Like, he had me put it on for something, like to just record the chorus or something. Yeah. And he was like, that's so cool. And so then he just started always doing with that. And, they come in a group of like 3 or 4 rappers, and so he would go in there and he'd be like, put that autotune on, and I look back and the other rappers are like rolling their eyes like, he's at it again, like he's obsessed with the autotune. But he like always had to have it on, so it was hilarious. But yeah, it can become a crutch, but it's good and bad. And the other bad thing about it is now people have become like so used to hearing autotune that they think that that's what people actually sound like, and so I've even heard there's been circumstances where artists go on their social media and will sing something a cappella and then get knocked by all their fans because they didn't sound like the real recording, because they were just singing themselves and not being auto-tuned and fixed in the studio. So.
Along those lines, and this could go into a very different conversation.
Yeah.
But with the innovation of autotune, it has kind of shaped the way that vocalists are like learning to sing now. Like there's a cool like vocal technique called reverse yodeling that sounds like it sounds like real autotune depending on how accurate the singer is. And a lot of like younger artists are trying to imitate that autotune sound with just their natural vocals, and some can get pretty close to it, not exactly on. But it's just crazy how that has shaped people's vocal techniques. But that's also like a different conversation. But
It's true. That's like total
Segue
rabbit
that.
hole. Sorry, I
It's
started
super
taking
cool.
it.
But
Yeah,
like,
there's tons of stuff with that. So.
yeah. We could probably go on to delay.
Well, let's talk about distortion so we can
distortion
get the 5 categories.
Yeah.
So distortion's the last one, and that's just like it's also called harmonic processing, where you have guitar amps and stuff that you can put things through, but you're basically distorting the sound, and not just the fundamental, but also the harmonics to create different effects and stuff. But I think it's an honorable mention. And there's like bit crushers and such where just different kind of distortions. So there's lots of ways to create distortion.
So here's a question for you guys: saturators, are they distortion? Are
they are distortion. They're distorting the harmonics.
That's what
distortion.
that's what I felt like.
So essentially what you're getting, it's cool to look at like a waveform when it goes through a like some form of distortion, whether that's like a saturator or like a full out distortion or like fuzz or something like that. 'Cause it does different things to the signal. So if you have like a sine wave that's going through, you've got your perfect like circle 360 degrees. When you push that through and start to drive that harder, the signal wants to go above the threshold that it's allowed, and so it kind of clips off the signal a little bit. And
Squares it off. Yeah.
So you get a square wave if you overload it. But the cool thing with saturation, and this is kind of getting into like electronics a little bit, like tube saturation or like transformer saturation, is it's doing that, but because of the electronic, it doesn't clip, but it excites the harmonics, and it excites the harmonics that are pleasing to our ear, and so we like those kind of harmonics. Whereas if you distort like an electronic signal going into like a circuit, like an audio signal that goes into a circuit that's not using a transformer or a tube, it overloads that and it kind of squares off of it, and we don't necessarily like those harmonics that are created from that.
From it being squared off. Yeah. Now, with modern plugins, it's important to realize that they've created algorithms and they've designed these things to manage those things so that they sound like the analog counterparts. Yeah. Like there are some fantastic plugins out there. So don't get into this whole thing where it's like, oh, I don't have that like $60,000 like 1960s vintage compressor or saturator. By the way, compression and saturation kind of intermingle a little bit, because when you compress things, you get saturation. Partially because that's an important thing. It's not the same. Saturators are not the same thing as compressors, but realize that compressors will add saturation, and saturation kind of delves into a little bit of that.
If you push a compressor far enough, you can get into distortion, and distortion is it's technically compressing the signal in a way.
Well, that's what a limiter's doing, is essentially, squaring off the signal. But yeah. So there's distortion for you.
Yeah.
There's again, honestly, each of these different types of effects could be episodes. And if you guys want to hear that in the future, definitely type it down in the comments or like shoot us an email.
Like and subscribe.
Shameless plug for the Soundcast.
Hit the notification bell and you'll be notified.
Very notifyingly. Yeah.
Let's jump into delay and reverb.
Yeah, let's talk about the history a little bit, because I think that's interesting. Because if you think about it, a lot of this is, it's all directly tied to the technology and the progression of it. So if you think back, all the way back to the beginning of the beginning days of recording,
What year is that, Todd? What year?
About a century ago, before the turn of the century. Yeah, when I was a kid.
Yeah, right.
But like, if you think about like just natural sound, and when we first started recording, all we could do was just capture the natural sound. So you have two things that are happening naturally. and there's just natural reverb or natural ambience, as it's called, where you go into a room and there's the actual ambience of the room, the sounds bouncing around. And then there is some delay that can happen naturally in real life, and usually that's like a nice big solid straight wall in the back of a club or something like that, or a mountain across a big old valley where you can hello, and hear it coming back at you. So that was all we really had. The old people before our time, had to record, and was just like, put your mics up in a space that has some natural ambience, natural reverb, or has some kind of slap back echo off that back wall. It's slapping back off that back wall. And so that was the limitation, was that. So there's your first beginning of it. And then, of course, as they started to record, they were like, how can we use a controlled environment to add those things in artificially? And so there was, the first step was with reverb was, why don't we use a room that we can put a mic in and some speakers
and then send sound into that. That was so cool.
Crazy
like such
idea,
an
right?
ingenious, like, oh, we like the sound of this room. Here, we're going to put a speaker in it, and we're going to put a microphone on the other side, or microphones throughout the whole frickin' room, and we're going to pick the microphone we like the most of that. It's really cool. I love the ingeniousness of these engineers that
coming up
let's just
with
do that. Oh.
like, it's the limitations that created the different things. So that's chamber reverb.
Right.
And then later do they get into is the next one plate reverb?
Yeah, spring and plate, kind of similar.
Those are fun.
Yep. So they're just
I can get this one because they suspend a metal plate in a box, or something like a box, and then they basically send a sound through the sheet via a transducer. By the by, quick note, a transducer is basically something that transfers one type of energy to another type of energy. A microphone is a transducer, a speaker is a transducer. Yeah. They do the same thing in reverse. So in this case, they basically hook up like a transducer, i.e. a microphone or a speaker, to the plate, one on one side, one on the other side. It vibrates and it causes that to go through the plate, and then they take it out on the other side, and that's how they get that plate reverb.
The warbliness.
It's really cool.
So like as you started out, you'd want to basically like warm up your plate, wouldn't you? So that because as you use it more, it'll change the sound, and so you want to use it for a little bit before you like commit that.
Right.
Get a more even sound across the whole thing.
Yeah, because if it's cold, it's going to be harder to
That's
move.
another thing with like old like tube amp microphones and like those types of things. You have to let them warm up to reach their characteristic sound, because if they're running cold, they don't do that. And with older gear, when it's not solid state, you'll have that concern. You'll have that issue. So plate reverb is that way. Spring reverb is the same thing, but instead of a plate, they're using a bunch of springs in a box.
And a plate is like a sheet of metal, like a big, think of like a
aluminium.
Yes.
No,
But-
probably more like copper or some like maybe like an iron of sorts.
Yeah, usually it's metal, like stainless
like these-
steel sort of thing.
And these
Right.
Steel sheet.
these plates were like huge. Like these sheets of metal were huge. Like
Yeah.
they would take up like an entire room.
Yeah, they're like, a small plate is like 5 feet long by like 3 or 4 feet high.
Yeah.
Part of it, I think, has to do with the size of your low frequency waves and being able to reproduce that through. I'm guessing. I don't
it's
know.
going to affect it. But the cool thing about the plate is like the edges of the plate really act as the borders of the room. So it's really like being like sending your reverb in a square room, but it has more of a metallic-y sound, which is cool.
It actually is good sometimes if your vocals are buried to use a plate reverb to bring out some of the brightness in them. If they're, again, it comes down to brightness, because plate reverbs add brightness.
Yeah, they're really bright.
Yeah.
But they're great on vocals for that
Right.
reason. So anyways,
Yeah,
the next thing that happened was they were kind of stuck at that point, and then digital reverb, where then you got back into what I was saying before about the different delays, because reverb really is a whole series of delays and different EQ curves on those. You're gonna add.
like a really renowned model, the like Lexicon 480, is that the one?
Yeah.
And when we were talking about using multiple delays. Well, as far as I understand it, and this could be wrong, so correct me if I'm wrong, but there's essentially 480 delay points in that, and that's why it was so good, because at that time it was the most points of delay that had been built into a hardware unit.
That explains why they have that as one of my reverb options on my SQ6. It's 480. Now I know why.
Well, that makes sense. I've never heard that, but I don't doubt that's true. And then you had the 960 as well. So there's a lot of Lexicon, lots of other TC Electronics, lots of companies were building these algorithms of these delays and EQ curves to create different sounding rooms. Right. And they, of course, created ones that tried to sound like chambers and plates and real ambience places. But in the process, created all these sounding reverbs that didn't really exist in any of those spots. So we had to
work well and have certain values and uses, like plates. I will also add one more plug. So these are a lot of the traditional kind of reverbs, and impulse reverbs are, I don't know if they're really more modern, but that's the next thing. Yeah.
That's the next step. So what's an impulse or convolution reverb or impulse response?
So what they do is they set up a microphone in that space. Yeah, I'm going to tell you right now about impulse reverbs that are super cool because they are impulses of those. Okay, so an impulse reverb is you take a microphone, you take a speaker, you put it into a space. That speaker emits tones of different varying sizes, and the microphone then listens to those tones. They use mathematics, algorithms to basically reproduce the sound and the acoustics of that space based off of the sounds that you are projecting into that space, because we know what the sounds we are reproducing into that space are supposed to be, and now we know what they sound like when they come back into that microphone. They can then create spaces, and they can they can do the Grand Ole Opry Home, is a place where they could copy that space, or the Sydney Opera Theater, the weird one. There's a bunch of different places, and you can actually buy those online. It's really cool. They have a lot of plugins that you can get, and you can even purchase specific impulse reverbs from certain locations all over the world, like Prague and their places and sound stages like that. But impulse reverbs are just designed from that impulse of the sound hitting that space and being recorded by a microphone, and then using mathematics to reconstruct that acoustic environment.
And generally they'll move, they'll play the sound in one position and the mic in one position, and then they'll move the mic to all sorts of different positions, and then all together those positions together are put together in an impulse response,
right?
Algorithm, which then recreates the space.
I would venture a guess that they probably use a set of microphones that have been tested and are similar, like matched pairs, but maybe a matched 7 set or 5 set or whatever.
Yeah,
my guess.
Yeah. It can go from the simplest one speaker, one mic, up to tons and tons of mics, so it can get super complex. Yeah. But you can do these yourself with these convolution reverbs. A lot of them will let you create your own impulses. So you'll see the term IR for impulse response. So any reverb that says IR or convolution is this type of reverb. And the nice thing is they've taken and made convolutions or impulse responses of all of those previous reverbs. So they've done impulses of chambers, plates, springs, and then of course all the patches in those digital reverbs.
Right.
And so now we have everything at our fingertips with these convolution reverbs.
You can just buy it.
Yeah.
Now, I will say what's cool about modern reverbs and impulse reverbs is you can get some that allow you to blend between two different spaces, and that allows you to create a more intricate or interesting reverb rather than you always run this, and this is kind of outside of the scope of this a little bit. You always run the risk of sounding too much the same or too much like the plugin. If you just use the base level plugins, it's important to understand what those things do and to mix and match things and not use the same things every single time, because then things will start to sound too samey at times. You run the risk of sounding too samey if you use the same thing.
Samey.
Yeah.
It's an official term.
That is a term. I have put it down
the
today.
Official
Term of the week. Samey.
Too samey.
Samey.
Yeah, what's up?
Joe Samey Laforte.
We didn't really talk that much about delay either.
Yeah, I was gonna say let's get on to the
delay sucks.
To delay. So delay's got a cool history too.
I guess.
Which delay's history is a little shorter. So what was the first delay, gentlemen?
Just a wall slapback.
Well, yeah, the natural, yeah.
Magnetic tape players?
There we go. Tell us
Tape
about
delay.
that, Joe. Yeah.
Well,
tape
no,
delay.
all it is like with magnetic tape players, you can just do echo and looping effects with those things, and they would basically just play with the tapes and play things back at different speeds, right? Or I'm thinking something else.
No, it's true, but it's all based on the distance between the playhead and the record head. So it's the record, yeah. So the distance between that, as the tape goes by, it plays back the signal, and you send it through the console, and then you send it back to the tape, and it goes on the record head, and then it takes a second to go from the record head back to the playhead again, and so then you hear it. So it's that time that it takes to travel from the record head to the playhead that is the delay time. So the speed of the tape and the distance between those two is what affects it.
Right.
So
that makes sense.
At first, you just had like 7.5 inches per second or 15 inches per second, and so you only had like 2 delay times. But then they started to create, variable speed tape, and then they even made it so that there's devices that will let you adjust the distance between those two heads to create those times. So
That's cool.
So that's why tape delay, the cool thing about it is as you feed it back into it, which is called feedback, so you take the delay and you feed it back in again.
I abhor feedback.
This is
All
a good,
forms of
this
feedback
is a good
are
feedback.
bad.
It's a good
No,
feedback.
there is no good feedback. People telling me how to do my job?
Yes,
bad.
there are.
No. I am a live sound engineer. I will not be bullied by you two weirdos.
We like to have feedback in the studio.
No,
just on
I
our
hate
delay.
feedback. Feedback is bad. I don't like hearing it from
On
people.
our,
I don't
on
like
our
hearing
delay,
it from
on
systems.
our guitars.
No feedback. I hate it. No,
But-
no more feedback. Stop it.
But like as you would like feedback a signal into itself, you get
Feedback,
the-
and it hurts
well the tape
my soul.
the tape changes how the signal sounds, and then that comes out, and then you put that taped signal back into it, and so it does even more stuff to it, and over time that signal kind of degrades in a way, which is kind of what makes the like tape delay kind of special. It adds that kind of like
And
tape saturation.
It goes back to that harmonic kind of thing.
Right.
So the more delays you have, the more degraded or distorted it gets. And so that's really the sound of tape delay. So,
Can we also just like recognize how much of these effects are really just people like either messing around with things or like happy accidents that just happen and they're like, oh, that sounds kind of cool.
yeah.
I kind of want to repeat that. Or like distortion is very much like, oh, we're going to turn the gain all the way up and see what happens. Oh, I kind of like that. That's what's given us most of these effects.
That's like the Motown sound, basically.
Right. And like
Motown
even
vocal
now,
sound.
like grunge. I've been listening to like, what is it? My Bloody Valentine, which is like a 90s band that's like like a lot of weird distortion and like just like weird artifacting and stuff. It's really cool.
In like the heavier style, they will often add distortion to like the screaming vocals because it helps bring in like more intensity to them.
But see, like all of those things are like, they're not like, oh, we're like design like, because some people get into this attitude of like, oh, it's got to be like scientific or like squeaky clean, or this idea of like this perfection in audio, and I like the dirtiness and the chaos of audio. And maybe it's because I'm the live sound engineer, but like I value that. Says the person who hates feedback.
Another happy accident that was created in the studio was gated reverb.
Right.
And that was just they put a mic in the room and they turned the compression all the way up on it. That way they could hear the person in the tracking
talkback.
room. Yeah,
like a talkback mic. Yeah.
Right.
And then a producer was listening to the drummer play with that, and then heard the playback, and the engineer muted the mic that had that, and it's like, wait, it sounds different. Why does it sound different? I liked how it sounded.
Because it was coming through the
gated
talkback
And that's
mic
an
that was being
iconic
gated.
sound of the 1970s and 80s for like that
Yeah,
gated
in the
reverb
80s.
snare, like the 80s, right? Yeah, 80s, whatever.
Yeah,
Anyways,
yeah.
so like that's some cool stuff, and like you have to remember as an audio person that like 9 times out of 10, like a lot of these things is experimentation and exploration. Yes, there is science. Yes, there is math. Understanding those things and like understanding that is like a basis for that, but realize that your ears are probably going to lead you in a new direction that you haven't thought about.
Like it comes down to like if somebody's telling you, you know, oh, these are the rules. You know, there are like rules of thumb that you can loosely like start. You start with those just to learn the basics, but like don't use them as hard rules. If it sounds good, it is good, and that's kind of like the basis of why we decided to do this podcast. You know, if it sounds good, it is good.
If it sounds good, it is good.
I will add another thing. Also, and I personally need to do better about this. I gatekeep a lot in my job because when I work in live sound, there's a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, I can mix. And you're like, you listen to what they're doing and you're like, no, you really can't. Don't be afraid to take good information from bad sources. Because now that's also really hard to do, especially with how much stuff is out there on the internet and all over like YouTube and places. There's a lot of people with a lot of different opinions and a lot of different thoughts. That being said, there's also some really good thoughts out there. And I don't think it's good to necessarily say no to everything. I also think it's not good to just take everything and just like assume everyone's right. You have to kind of find your own path, and everyone's on their own hill to climb, and some people are better than others. Some people are grinding it out more than others. Some people are just luckier than others. But don't just take everything, but don't just throw it all away. Kind of find a good middle ground for yourself, and you'll know that as you get more into audio.
I think the most important thing is, you know, take the concepts that you learn and experiment with them. You know, you may learn something new you didn't know. Go ahead and try it out.
Until you understand it. Like, play with it backwards and forwards. Like, that's how I learned compression, was I over-compressed, and then I brought it back. And as I came to understand and hear those things more clearlier, yeah, that's another one for you, kids.
Clearlier.
Clearlier.
Samey and clearlier.
We're going to keep a tally, huh? No, but, like, once I understood compression better, that's when I became better at compression. Like, you have to push and pull on these things. Make it nasty, and then bring it back. And then make it subtle. There are times and places for all of those things. I don't think there's ever a point where you're going to say it's, like...
Well, just kind of with saturation, too, you know? Bring up your saturation plugin or whatever you're using to saturate, and saturate to the point where it's like, oh my gosh, this sounds nasty. Why would you put this on? And then dial it back, and then turn off your plugin, turn it on, listen to it. You know, really listen to how it sounds with and without after you've dialed it back. But definitely, you know, you have to experience them in extremes in order to really. Well, I guess you don't have to, but I recommend, you know, doing it in extremes to really learn how it's affecting the signal.
I mean, if you can hear it, you can hear it, but whatever.
Yeah, but you got to push it kind of beyond it, you know. And so many things in audio are, you know, put that high pass filter until it turns to paper, and then back it off. And, you know, push this a little, put that delay up so you can hear it, and then bring it back so you barely can, you know?
Sweeping your EQs, boost boost to find the thing that's really bad, and then you dunk it. You just get rid of that crap.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, we probably should wrap up, so...
Make things sound good.
Good luck, don't suck, mix good. Thanks for coming and listening to us on episode 4. Have a good one.